Welcome to another NJ Thrives Thursday. As you probably know, we host these every Thursday at 12 p.m. This is a weekly webinar series for small business owners. A little sneak peek coming in, I'm not going to tell you the month, but soon, in the coming months, we're actually going to have an NJ Thrives Tuesdays. So watch out for that one. That one's going to be more tailored towards personal development kind of stuff. So yeah, that's super exciting. As for me, I'm your host, Christian Fichardo. I'm NJSBDC marketing consultant and CEO at NalumaMedia.com. So for those of you who don't know, NJSBDC is a statewide program powered by SBA and partners to help small businesses in New Jersey with no-cost small business consulting, training and events starting at $0 like this one, and exclusive small business resources only available to our clients. Our agenda, as always, is we're going to go over some headlines, the webinar, and then at the end, we're going to take some questions. So for this week, there wasn't much. Much of it is going to be an update. So the NJSBDC Capital team. So the NJSBDC has pulled together a team of our top finance consultants. And we created a team that helps small businesses get the funding that, as it says there, that they deserve. So the Capital team will help you, we'll guide you in the process. We'll help you find what programs are best for you. We'll help you find a lender, things like that. So you're guided with an expert. And this is all no cost, $0. Again, it's funded by the SBA and state partners and what have you. So I think this is a great opportunity for, if you need funding, just please make sure that you have at least 2 years in business. This really helps us get the ball rolling for those who need it and can actually acquire a loan or grant, So whatever's out there will help you get it. Now, next headline here is the NJEDA Small Business Lease Grant Program. And the applications aren't opened yet. They open, or applications will be accepted on a rolling basis beginning October 20th. Okay. So yeah, this is the page. This will tell you the eligibility requirements and what you'll probably get. So this is a great program that I've been talking about for the past 3 or 4 weeks. So please make sure you get details on that, if it makes sense. And our third headline is October 28th. NJSBDC is hosted by Rutgers Business School, and at the Rutgers Business School, they're hosting their 6th annual conference or symposium. And a very notable person, Ray Chambers, he's a philanthropist, humanitarian. He's won 2011 Times Magazine 100 Most Influential People in the World. George Bush gave him a Presidential Citizen Medal for helping worldwide, helping malaria worldwide. So that's huge, right? And he works with the World Health Organization now. So this event is totally free. The topic is managing uncertainty, financing, workforce, and sustainability. So who better than show you all that than a person like Ray Chambers. So this is October 28th at 9 a.m. So, oh, perfect. Actually, right before an NJ Thrives Thursday. So you could go into that and then hop right into our webinar here. So that being said, there's 3 things to keep in mind before we start this webinar. Type in your questions in the Q&A box below. Once this webinar closes out, you're going to get a 3-minute survey. And once you complete that, you'll get the webinar recording and materials. And number 3, by attending this event, you're eligible for the Upgrade Your Business certificate. More details on that at the link there. All links that I've shown you so far will be in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michelle Schaap for part 2 of our Protect Your Tech series for this Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So how are you, Michelle?
I am well, thank you. And everybody, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And for those of us who are Star Trek fans, we're married to Trekkies. And I am married to a Trekkie, and he's compelled me to become a Star Trek fan. I hope you appreciate the homage to William Shatner's recent venture into the final frontier.
Awesome. So for this one, you're going to talk about how to identify business assets at risk of cyber attack. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and you can go ahead and we can get the show rolling.
And tell me, can you see that, Chris?
Yes, I can.
Terrific. So a couple of our participants already put into the chat the type of businesses that they are in. And I apologize if I'm going to pick on you a little bit because you did share with us, but I think it's very helpful for our attendees to understand why it's so important to understand what your assets are. To say that you're going to protect information, it helps to know what information does that mean. So one of our attendees today is in marketing. And I will share with you, one of my clients is a small marketing firm, but has some very large customers. And what she does is helps, let's suppose Chris is launching a new soda product. And Chris has a new trademark. He's got a new brand, a new logo. He's got all sorts of marketing material that he wants to share with the folks who are going to buy this soda, but he hasn't launched it yet. They've also used some third parties to develop ad copy, what have you. There's information with manufacturers, distributors, and so on. And in dealing with the marketing agency itself has its own employees, as well as some freelancers who work on Chris's campaign. The marketing agent knows when the campaign is going to launch, where it's going to launch, and so on and so forth, all of the collateral that's going to go with the launch of the product, all stuff that's Chris's new secret sauce, pun intended. Now, consider what happens if that marketing agency was compromised. And in the case of my client, they were compromised not by an external threat, but by an internal disgruntled employee. The employee stole company files. The files that were stolen included Chris's campaign in our scenario. It included the names of the independent contractors that were working on the campaign. Read that as W-9s showing their social security numbers. It showed Chris's new logo. It showed his business plan, fill in the blank, all of that stuff. And when we think about cybersecurity and privacy, oftentimes people are thinking about personally identifiable information or protected health information. But if you were my client, the marketing agency, Chris's business has now just lost value if, in fact, somebody has stolen that information. Somebody could now try to steal that brand or try to steal his thunder. What type of claim would Chris have against the marketing agency after that type of compromise? Not to mention the fact that the marketing agency then had a traditional breach because of the information that was leaked with regard to independent contractors working on Chris's campaign. We also have an environmental consultant who's participating today. And let's suppose that now, Chris, you're going to wear all sorts of hats today. And Chris is a real estate developer. And Chris has bought a piece of property that he didn't realize used to be a chemical waste plant. And the site has all sorts of disastrous stuff. I mean, it could glow in the dark. And Chris wants to sell this property. Now, Chris may want to share information. He may not want to share information with a potential buyer about what is there. All the information that the folks who did the environmental testing for him is now in their systems. And depending upon what Chris does with that information, and granted, he does have legal obligations. He's got to clean up the site. You don't want to just sell a pig in a poke because needless to say, there'll be liability. But let's suppose Chris is a bad guy. Sorry, Chris. And he just wants to make money and flip his property, and he doesn't disclose to somebody what's glowing in the dark under there. If that environmental consultant is compromised, information that Chris may not want to have shared with his lenders or his investors or anybody else is now been compromised. You need to think about what you're doing in your business. And when we think about what type of assets we're worried about protecting, you also have to think about not just digital assets, but physical assets. So one of our clients is in the medical field, and they have, as you walk into their building, boxes. And I said to them when I was doing a non-technical risk assessment, guys, what's in all of these boxes? And they said, oh, those are things waiting to go off to Iron Mountain. And I opened up the first box, and there was an order form for a new device for a new patient. On the top page was the name of the patient, where the procedure was being done, and all sorts of other protected health information. I wouldn't need a computer to compromise that asset. All I would need to do is take out my cell phone and take a picture of that top page. Worse yet, if there wasn't proper security on the physical environment, I could walk out with a box and now think about how many patients' information I've just compromised by walking away with that box. So when we think about what we're doing here, we need to think about what are the assets. Now, Chris also mentioned that this discussion is part of a series, and in fact, it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and so there are 4 of these in this month. The last series that we did, we're talking about the legal landscape in the state of New Jersey. Today, we're focusing only on what your assets are, what's at risk, understanding what the vulnerabilities are, and what your residual risk might look like after you had put into controls. Next week, we're going to be talking about how to prepare for an attack on those assets. And finally, what to do if, God forbid, you are in the midst of an attack. But let's get into today's subject. And by the way, folks, please do not hesitate to throw questions into the Q&A section. I'd rather address your questions as I'm on the particular topic because I think it'll be helpful for everybody. And don't worry about throwing me off because I'll come back to the slides. Now, of course, no legal presentation is complete without my legal disclaimer. So here is our legal disclaimer. If you would like to consult with me after this program, please feel free to reach out to the New Jersey SBDC to contact me. But in the meantime, so let's get into this. You've listened to me hopefully enough times through the SBDC, and you are a little bit parenting. And you know that you cannot keep your head in the sand, but you want to get started and you don't know where to get started. So what you want to think about is who, what, and where. Who's at risk, what are the assets, and where are they located? And once you've identified those assets and assessed the issues, how do you then mitigate that? And what you'll sometimes hear folks talk about is residual risk. Residual risk is what is left after you've put into controls, but we'll get into that later. And let's see if I can move this forward. There we go. I wanted to just take a minute to talk about the difference between privacy and security, because you can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. And you say, okay, now she's giving us puzzles. Chris gives me his information. I now have Chris's name. I have his social security number. I know where he lives. I know that he likes cheesecake and so on and so forth. I can take measures intended to secure that information, whether I encrypt that information, whether I prevent employees in my office from looking at that information unless they have a need to know. I can take that information and store it offline. That would be securing that information. When we're talking about privacy, that gets into what Chris's rights are vis-a-vis that information. In other words, does Chris have the right to tell me, hey, don't collect my information in the first place? Or you collected it and it's time to forget me or to update that information. What we're focusing on today is not privacy, we're focusing on security. Again, in terms of what needs to be protected, you need to think about not only what your assets are, but where those assets are stored. So we think about digital assets, Think about physical assets and your physical environment. Think about technology. In other words, are you using software as a service? Do you have devices connected to your systems? Do you have personal devices that personnel are using? And by the way, when we think about assets, and I alluded, for example, to business assets, whether it's the environmental study done on Chris's property, whether it's the new plan for Chris's soda, whether it's the list of people who you're not hiring, but you did background checks and made that decision not to hire the person because of the background check results. All of that are assets that you need to be thinking about. And your incident response plan, again, we'll be talking about that in next week's session, that's your business asset. Don't store that asset on your computer because, by the way, if you're hit by a ransomware attack and that's where it's stored, that's not going to be very helpful. And we want to think about what assets do we really need? If I was looking at Chris's resume, and no disrespect, Chris, I decided, you know what, he really doesn't fit the bill. I don't need to hire him. If I'm not going to consider Chris for a position down the road, do I need to keep that information? Do I need to keep information about me vetting him as a potential candidate? And if the answer is no, why am I keeping that in my asset inventory? If I've got an employee who hasn't worked for me for 20 years, why am I keeping that in my asset inventory? That's just one more thing that I have to worry about that I need to protect. And again, because we're dealing with a remote workforce or workforce that is mobile, when we think about what our assets are and where they are, you absolutely need to think about the devices that the technology is stored on and think about how you're accessing the technology. Passwords, that's an asset. If Chris has software as a service and I use Chris's service and my login credentials are compromised, not only have I compromised those credentials, and by the way, my contract with Chris probably says that I'm responsible for use of my access credentials, but now whoever has those credentials can go into Chris's software as a service environment and see what I've processed in that environment. And so the compromise leads to a much larger compromise, which is why it's so important to understand what indeed your assets are.
Quick
Again,
question, Michelle.
please.
Sorry to interrupt. But what are the most common assets you've seen be compromised?
Access credentials. Access credentials are a huge target. The reason being, they then let you into all sorts of other assets. It can be the first line of attack to launch future attacks. That's the greatest. And the problem with access credential compromises is that people are sloppy and they're lazy. So for those of us who've been worrying about these things for several years, you may or may not remember the catastrophic Yahoo breach. First, we found out it was 500,000 users. Then we found out it was over 1 million users. Then we found out it was probably 1 billion users. Well, a couple of years later, I got an email from one of my friends, and the email address was joeschmo@yahoo.com. And I picked up the phone and I called Joe Schmo and I said, "You've got to be kidding. You're still using Yahoo for your email after all that happened. What are you, nuts?" I said, "And by the way, I'm just curious, did you change your Yahoo password after that happened?" And there's silence on the other end of the phone. And all I'm thinking is, really? The problem with access credentials is a lot of people use them across different accounts. Even though that is a worst practice
Right.
possible, people do it. And so when you think about your business environment and the assets that you want to protect, you tell your employees, don't use the same password, don't use the same passcode, what have you, that you access your business accounts that you do, for example, for Facebook or what have you. But the problem is not everybody does what you tell them. And so even though your work environment may not have been compromised, it could be that, sorry, Chris's Facebook page got compromised and somebody got his Facebook passcode, and that's the same thing he uses for your work environment. If once somebody gets that, you've got a problem. Now, I actually spoke last week in Chicago, by the way, in person with human beings, and I was speaking to a bunch of surety folks about construction industry and cyber. And of course, I'm sure many of you are thinking, what does cybersecurity and data protection have to do with the construction industry? Well, first of all, when we talk about assets, If you are constructing a nuclear power plant, do you really want the plans for that power plant to get out? That would be a really bad thing. And again, when we think about the construction industry, what about the plans for a smart building? What about for the access credentials to the smart elevator? Again, when we think about access credentials. And when we think about business email, and again, I'll just stick with the construction industry for a minute. There was a very large, and when I say large, multinational construction project manager that had the email accounts of over 200 employees compromised. When you think about the assets and the information that was in those 200 business emails for projects around the world, it's a staggering thought. And so when we identify assets, you really have to think broadly. You've got your human assets, you've got your personnel's information, you've got your secret sauce, you've got your customer's secret sauce. Really think about what constitutes your assets, the architecture of your system, how you are configured. So I know that we've got somebody who does environmental consulting on the call, and we also have somebody who sells cyber insurance. Think about the information that the person who sells cyber insurance has about her customers, particularly if there's a questionnaire that's been completed that says, have you had a data breach? Do you use multi-factor authentication? Now, by the way, if the answer is yes, you've had a data breach, and no, you don't use multi-factor authentication, the odds are good that cyber insurance companies, or rather carriers, are not going to give you coverage. However, she now has that information in her database. Chris, you're being thrown under the bus all the time today. I'm sorry. Chris applied for cyber insurance and he said, yes, I've been breached. No, I don't use multi-factor authentication. And that's now in the insurance agent's database when she was helping Chris apply for the insurance. If a bad actor gets into the insurance agent's system, now somebody knows not only have I gotten into the insurance agent, I can now know that Chris is not smart and he's not using multi-factor authentication. So let's see if I can get access credentials, passwords for some of his employees, and boom, I'm into his system because they weren't using two-factor authentication. So again, we really need to understand when we're talking about assets, what we are talking about and what needs to be protected. Again, we're not talking about just R&D or business plans. And by the way, let's talk about business plans for a minute. Let's suppose that you're thinking about selling your business. Do you really want your rank and file to know that they may not have a job in 6 months when you sell your company? Do you want your employees to know that you're moving your factory from New Jersey to Texas because Texas has better tax rates? Do you want your personnel to know that somebody's being let go? This type of information is kept on your systems. And if that's not properly secured and access credentials to that information not properly secured, that's problematic. One of the things that we're talking about today are risk assessments and penetration tests. If the results of those tests are compromised, you've just given a roadmap to a bad actor how to compromise your systems. The other thing that you want to think about when you're saying, what are my assets? Look at your contracts with your customers. I alluded to Chris having this new soda, okay? If the contract that you have with Chris has a definition of his confidential information, those are the types of assets you want to think about when you're saying, what do I need to secure? All of these things need to be considered. If you're in litigation strategy is an asset that you want to keep secure. Now, New Jersey's definition of personal information, just like the rest of the country's definition, is always evolving. Read that as expanding. So just in the last 2 years, biometric data was added to the definition of personal information in New Jersey. Depending on the jurisdiction, it may also include whether or not you're Jewish, Muslim, Catholic, whatever your religion may be. I don't mean to leave any out here. It may indicate what your political leanings are. You may be a Republican, you may be a Democrat, you may be independent. Again, that is considered personal information. Longitude and latitude. And it's interesting, I'm working with one of my clients right now, and they are data aggregators. And part of the information that they get, which is a little bit creepy, by the way, is the location of my cell phone. They don't know necessarily that the cell phone belongs to Michelle Schapp. However, if you got the longitude and latitude of my cell phone, where it's currently located, and you track that over time, and you know that this device stays at this point on the globe for 8 hours on a daily basis, you now have a pretty good idea where the house is that this cell phone lives. And
Yeah.
by the way, you can then use that information to figure out by looking at deed records, who owns that house. And now suddenly you've built out a profile. So when
Yeah.
we think about what personal information is, think about also what can be gleaned, not only from what you have, but what's available publicly to really build out a profile. And that's information you absolutely want to make sure is appropriately secured and protected. If you're a healthcare provider, you want to make sure that you are keeping secure, protected health information. And going back to your hats as employers, you may have information not only about your employees, but your employees' dependents. Think about what you've got and where.
So quick question on the biometric stuff. I know that that could be, like a fingerprint on your phone to unlock it. How is something like that in danger of getting hacked? I'm assuming, it's your fingerprint.
Well, okay, so those of us who watch silly shows on television, whether it's CSI or NCSI, whatever those things are, if I put my fingerprint on my phone, can somebody lift the fingerprint off? And if it's a digitized fingerprint, if you've got a digital time clock that takes an impression of my thumbprint, can that be compromised? If you've got retinal scans and you then get that, I mean, I know we're sounding a little bit James Bondish, but guess
Right.
what, guys? This data is then digitized. And if it's not properly secured either by you or your vendors, you've got a problem. So again, you need to understand what data you have collected and what data you're entrusting to your third-party vendors, because you're responsible for protecting all of the information that you collect.
Oh,
And
actually, I have a
remember,
follow-up on that.
please,
So you mentioned vendors. So what would be a good question to ask a vendor that you're going to work with or you've been working with for a while? Should you ask them, what cybersecurity measures do you have? What checklist items should we ask?
absolutely. And by the way, Chris, you could go back to the folks at the SBDC, because I don't believe we actually have a vendor-centric program planned for the
Mm,
month of October. I know
mm,
I've touched on it in prior events that we've talked about, but let's get into that briefly, because this is a very important question.
mm.
Because again, when we think about where your assets are, your assets may not be in your environment. To Chris's point and whoever raised the question, the assets may be in your third-party providers. So I mentioned software as a service. The providers of those services are storing your access credentials. Are those access credentials saved in plain text, or are they encrypted? Are they hashed? How are they securing that? And now let's suppose also you have software on site or on premises software. It used to be back in the 90s that you would want to have your software vendor be able to remote into your system immediately. They would have ongoing open access so that they could fix the, oh my God, your software is not working, fix it now. Instead, what you want to do is tell your vendors, no, 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 no. You're not going to have an eye into my system on an open port basis. Instead, I will give you just-in-time access to fix it when I need it, and then I'm going to kick you out. And for small business owners, think about Square. Think about the data that Square is processing for you and your customers. If you look at the terms and conditions that you're clicking on when you say, yes, I'm going to use Square, although Square is indeed PCI compliant, and that's something you want to ask. Are you payment card industry compliant with their data security standards? But by the way, that standard's just the floor. That's the minimum of what a Square or any other payment processing company that you might be using should be meeting. You want to know, for example, are they ISO certified, depending upon what the company is and what they're processing for you? And if they have a SOC 2 Type 2 report, which would show what controls they have in place over a period of time, ask for that also. And then read the report. Don't just get the report. Look at it and understand, what does it tell you? Are they encrypting your data at just 128-bit encryption, which is pretty good encryption, but 256 is better? Are they limiting access to data that they have of you only to employees on a need-to-know basis? Does the company have robust onboarding and offboarding processes in place? And let's suppose Chris works for me and I hire him. He gets trained and he's going to be working in HR. So Chris has access to all sorts of sensitive information about my personnel. But Chris gets tired of working in HR and he says, you know what? I want to try my hand at sales. And I say, awesome. I'm going to transfer you over to sales. Well, if I don't disable Chris's access to HR information, then that's a poor practice on my part. And now he's got access to sales information. Should he have access to the entire sales database? And do I want to make sure Chris is putting into the database only minimal information? Because if Chris is pitching to me, and now he puts into the company CRM system, Michelle Schapp, she's got 2 kids, she loves cheesecake and so on. He's just built out a whole profile about me. And what if that gets compromised? And again, if you're using a third-party vendor for your CRM system and that gets compromised, you've just compromised your entire customer list. So when you're dealing with these third-party vendors, no matter what they're doing, you absolutely want to vet them. The questions that you're looking at internally, you want to ask them, are they doing risk assessments? And are they doing them annually? And if they're doing risk assessments, will you receive an executive summary that tells you what they've identified as potential risks? And by the way, once they get that risk assessment, are they responding to it? Or are they just saying, oh, that's nice, and putting it in the drawer? You may also want to ask your vendors, have you done a risk assessment since you went remote, assuming that they weren't originally remote before COVID? Because the same risk assessment that looked at the environment when people were working in their offices is not going to be the same and appropriate picture of people working at home, on home devices, and potentially on secure networks. Getting back to where we are here on the slide, I want to focus now on the fact that we are getting out again. I mentioned that I was in Chicago last week presenting to a conference of surety folks. Well, I went to the airport and I was working in the airport waiting for my flight. Then I got on the plane and I was working on something while I was on the plane. I went to the hotel, and when I wasn't presenting, I was working on my computer in my hotel room. And when I went down to the conference room, when I wasn't presenting, probably shouldn't have, but I was looking at my email on my computer and not necessarily paying attention to the other presenter. Now let's think about where my data could have been exposed while I was on planes, trains, automobiles, hotel rooms, Starbucks, fill in the blank. Well, let's suppose that I log into, or so I think I'm logging into, Hilton's Wi-Fi. What if in fact, and I didn't see, it said HIITON, and I didn't see that what was the L in Hilton was in fact a capital letter I. Somebody may have spoofed Hilton's Wi-Fi, and when I clicked on my computer to find available networks, I saw that and said, oh, there's the Hilton Wi-Fi. And for that matter, for those of us that still like paper, and I do, let's suppose that you didn't print out your boarding pass. So now you go down to the hotel lobby and you say, oh, look, there's a computer here that I can log in and print out my boarding pass. Once you've entered into your email on the hotel's computer and you print out your boarding pass, did you remember to log out? Or is somebody else going to see that? And by the way, do you really want to be able to do that on the hotel computer, or should you in fact plan ahead and have it on this instead of accessing it something on a hotel computer? When you're working in the airport, and now this will make you really paranoid, I see a lot of people charging their phones at those towers, except for the fact that overseas, certainly, I don't know if it's happened in US airports, but I can tell you it's happened internationally. Bad actors have gotten into those towers, and what they've done is they've installed devices that allow, when you plug in your device using the USB cord, so for example, my headphones are plugged into my power strip. I take this and I put it into that charging port at the hotel, but now this is attached not to my headphones, but to my cell phone. What I think is in fact giving me juice for my device, instead has malware put into that tower for power that's extracting data from my device while I'm charging it. Not to make you a little bit paranoid, but that's what's going on. So instead, what you may want to do is travel with a plug. So you plug this into the plug and then put that into a outlet just for electricity, not for a USB port. Things to think about while you're traveling.
No,
Now,
I'm never using one of those again.
yep. So Chris, let's suppose that you and I don't know each other and we are stuck sitting next to each other on a plane. I'm nosy. You get up to go to the restroom and you've left your computer up. And I look over and say, oh, that's interesting. Look what Chris does. He's in marketing and I see the launch of a new product. Cool. I take out my cell phone while Chris is still in the restroom. I take a picture of it. I just stole what's on there. Now, smart people would log off. At least have a privacy screen on your computer so nosy Nancy's like me can't look over and see what you're working on. And instead, think about maybe do you print out documents that you want to review? And for those of us that are really paranoid, and remember, I'm paid to be paranoid, I'll actually sanitize a document. So I'll remove the names of the parties and then print it out and review that while I'm traveling. So Chris is sitting next to me. He sees I'm working on a merger document, but he can't see who the parties are because I've removed that information. I can still get my work done, but he can't steal information. These are things that you need to think about, especially now that we're traveling again. Again, in terms of equipment, think about USB drives. And for those of you who've heard me speak before, you know one of the horror stories I share with was something from the ADA convention several years ago. So all the dentists were there at their convention, and they were being told that the codes to put in a root canal and what have you have changed. And everybody at the ADA convention is groaning, oh, what a pain in the neck. I now have to go back and deal with recoding systems. And so you get the USB drive. Well, the USB drive that was given out by the ADA folks, trusted source, was preloaded with malware. That's one problem when you put that into your system. But now what happens when you have your own information that you knowingly and have chosen to put onto a USB drive, can it walk away? And the short answer is, of course it can. So how do you secure that? Is the information encrypted before you stored it? When we think about cameras, again, this cell phone is a computer for all intents and purposes. It's got a camera. I can access my email and everything else. How is this secured? And if this is something that's my personal device and not a company issued device, but I'm accessing company information, how is it going to be secured? I mentioned before the construction industry, and you think about SCADA systems. How is the environment being monitored and how is that environment access being secured? One of the construction projects that I was working on, they were putting in a smart elevator. And the smart elevator has systems that allow you to monitor how it's functioning remotely. Well, there was a falling out between the owner and the installer of the elevator. And so the installer deactivated access to the systems. So the elevator wasn't working anymore. And he held the owner hostage until the owner paid the money the elevator installer wanted. You need to think about who's got access to what. And by the way, when we talk about devices, are they owned or leased? So let's suppose that, Chris, you've got so many new jobs today. Chris is in the leasing equipment business, and he leases copiers, laptops, all sorts of stuff. And I lease equipment from him at the beginning of the pandemic because everybody's going to work remotely and I want them to work on company issued devices. And they access my otherwise secure network on these devices. Now we're coming back to the office. I don't need all these leased laptops and I give them back to Chris. Here's the problem. Unless my contract says that Chris is responsible for wiping the data, he's not going to bother to do it. And when I returned all those devices, did I bother to do it? And if the answer is no, that's a problem. And even if I own the devices, what happens to the information that's stored on it when I go to donate it to a charity or I give it to my employees at end of life? Have I wiped the data that's on that device before I've returned it? I've talked before about our phones in our cars. A lot of people sync their phones to their cars so that they can dial hands-free, and they've got their call list right there. Well, I shared in previous lectures that when I got my last Audi off lease, It was pre-owned, let's face it, it was used. And I went to sync my phone with my new car or my new to me car, and already the call list was populated. And I was like, that's weird. Who are all these contacts? I realized it was the prior lessee of the car's information of who their points of contact are, which was a little bit creepy.
Hmm.
Copy machines are often leased. Copy machines store data. And if you've got copy machines that are connected to the internet, not only is it storing data, but it's transmitting data. And again, when we talk about vetting our vendors, ask the vendor of these devices, how is that internet connection secured? Understand what you're leasing from Chris to make sure it's appropriately secured. Think about what's in your wallet, what's in your cell phone. And by when we think about travel information, for folks that manage, let's suppose that you're doing a conference and you want to hire somebody like me to come speak at the conference and you're making the travel arrangements for me. Are you getting my known traveler number? Are you getting a copy of my passport? Are you getting my itinerary? So if somebody wants to cause Michelle trouble, they know where she's going to be and when. These things need to be protected.
I think we lost your audio, Michelle. Sorry, Michelle. I think we definitely lost audio. Let's see. I don't think it's working here. Can we get a 1 in the chat if you can still hear Michelle? If not, put a 0. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.
I'm back. Did you hear what I was just saying, Chris, or was I just moving my mouth?
you were just moving your mouth for that one. So I think for the last paragraph or so, I think we lost you.
Okay, well, now I am back in action. And by the way, this is important. And ironically, this happened, Chris, last time we did this or 2 weeks ago when we had done this, where again, we had a computer glitch. You always need to have a backup plan because if in fact you lose your data and you can't access it, that's going to be problematic.
Yeah.
So what we want to understand is what information we have and where it is. Have an inventory. If I've collected from Chris, his name, his address, and everything else, I need to know not only where do I have it, but who have I shared it with? I want to make sure if I've given it to my vendors, I know that they have it. And you want to think about data and asset life cycle. Where is it when you collect it? Where is it being stored? Where is it being processed? Who is processing it for me? And when I don't need it anymore, how am I deleting it? And am I deleting it securely? And going back to privacy for a minute, without having an inventory of assets, when Chris says, I want to be forgotten, how do I do that? If I don't know where all the data points are of Chris that I've collected, I can't honor that request. So it's really important. Now, Chris, I don't want to go backwards without making sure you did or did not hear what I said. So did you hear my commentary on leased equipment?
Yes. Well,
Okay,
that you
good.
have to make sure that you wipe your data before returning a lease, or
Good.
something like that.
I just want to make sure that when we lost the audio, we did not lose that.
Yeah, we were good with it.
Excellent. So again, I don't want to go backwards, but did you hear when I talked about travel arrangements and what a travel agent might have?
Don't believe so.
Okay.
Oh,
So
well,
I
someone
do
says
want to.
yes.
So Chris wasn't paying attention. Shame on you, Chris.
So it was me.
There we go. Okay, so then let's move forward. So again, you want to understand where your data is, map the data, and don't keep more than you need. If Chris used to work for me 20 years ago, do I really need his information? The odds are good. No. And again, somebody asked earlier, what about vendors? Before you entrust your data to vendors, make sure they're doing what you're asking them to do. Make sure that they're encrypting your information. Make sure it's at least rights access. Make sure that when the relationship is over, they've gotten rid of your data. And again, when we think about the Internet of Things and how connected devices are, let's suppose that you're in the medical device business. There was actually a horrible story recently. I believe it was reported either in the Wall Street Journal or one of the other newspapers about litigation about the death of an infant because monitoring systems at a hospital had been compromised by a ransomware attack. And information about the infant being in in distress was not being communicated to the nurse's station. The
Wow.
consequences, it's horrific, that the consequences of devices and systems not being secured are going beyond just having to report a data breach. And by the way, something that's now coming more and more into the news, which you folks may or may not have heard of, I'm sure you've heard about ransomware. There's also now killware. And unfortunately, killware is exactly what it sounds like. It is intended to destroy property and persons, whether it's to disrupt access to water, whether it's to disrupt access to electricity, or to cause a nuclear power plant to implode. These are things that are coming out there. And if you're not securing access credentials, if you're not employing appropriate controls when you're keeping this information, you're going to have a problem. So I talked before about risk assessments. You need to, once you've identified your assets, how are those assets exposed? How could they be exposed? How could they be exploited? Who should have access? Who shouldn't have access, internally and externally? I talked before about on-premises software and having your third-party vendor being able to support that by remoting in. If you have an open port, that's a point of vulnerability, particularly if the vendor uses admin 1, admin 2, and admin 3 as their points of contact into all of their customers. And if you've got employees like Chris who changed roles from HR to sales, have I put in a control that makes sure that Chris's access credentials to the HR database has been terminated? He doesn't need it anymore. And if, sorry, Chris, you're under the bus again, Chris is getting fired. Have I deactivated his access credentials before the interview in which I fire him? If not, that's a vulnerability that I've created by poor controls. Do I have appropriately configured firewalls? Do I have antivirus software in place? Is it up to date? And by the way, to the extent that your workforce is working remotely, did they have antivirus software on all of their devices? Have they changed the default passwords on their home routers? You need to understand where your vulnerabilities are. What is the attack surface to your environment? And when you've identified all of that, then you want to evaluate what are the risks created and what is the impact of those risks. And by the way, these are not casual analyses. So what you want to do is make sure that you're really understanding what you're getting into. And when we talk about employees as a point of access, if you've got somebody like me who's got a shoe fetish, and I do, I like my heels, preferably red, high. But if I'm shopping at Macy's.com and I'm clicking on a link that I think is Macy's, and in fact, it's haha, gotcha, not really Macy's, I'm a vulnerability. I'm a risk to your company. How do you control that risk? Do you train me? Do you do phishing exercises? Or do you terminate my access credentials because I've failed 3 phish tests? You want to understand where the exposure is. The other potential exposure that's now coming out is voice confusion. So we have a friend who unfortunately has ALS. And at a certain point, he's not going to lose the ability to speak. So he's doing voice banking, meaning that let's suppose that Chris, you have so many hats today. Chris and I are now involved in a relationship. And I'm the person with ALS. And I want to be able to tell Chris every day that I still love him, even though I can't say it. I could voice bank me saying to Chris, I love you. But now in that voice bank, somebody's recorded my voice. And if they get access to that voice bank And they can now record that and have the voice of Michelle, the intonation of Michelle say other things. How else can that be used? Not for good things, for telling Chris I still care for him, but now being able to, you remember those old scams? Your grandson's in Mexico, send money. But now they've got your grandson's voice and they've manipulated to say, Grandma, I'm in Mexico and I'm in jail, send me money. You need to understand where these vulnerabilities are and put into controls.
And you know that that's actually worse now because these days you can order from Amazon from a voice type of device like a Google Home or an Alexa, stuff like that, and they use voice recognition to make those orders, and they'll take it out of your wallet thinking it's you. So yeah, I could see how that could blow up.
Now, I see that Denise has raised her hands and she's wanted to know, let's see, I see, can a one-way video interview be compromised? Now, when you say one-way video, so presumably there is audio associated with the video. So in terms of how it's being compromised, first of all, you have to think about the technology that is allowing for that video conference to occur. Then you need to think about how it's being secured. So think about this right now. We're doing this webinar and we are on Zoom. Are people being admitted? And then is the door to this conference being closed afterwards? In other words, if Chris chooses not to admit other people, can anybody else get in? This video is being recorded. You've already told that when you join this video. But what's to stop you from recording a video with your own devices in your own room? And by the way, when we think about from the legal world, oftentimes I'll want a witness to something that let's suppose that Chris and I are now in litigation together. And I want to make sure somebody else hears when Chris threatens me. He may not know somebody's in the room with me. I may have somebody off camera who's in the room with me. So when you ask, can one-way video be compromised, it really depends on the technology and it depends upon the physical environment. And so for whoever the vendor is of that technology, ask these questions. How do you secure it? Do I not let somebody else in? How do I prevent things from being compromised? And understand the technology you're using. Understand the people that you're giving access to that technology and put into place processes that'll make it more secure. And again, when we think about home offices, do you have employees that live, in my case, only with my husband and my dog? And I assure you that my dog is not interested in information, not to my knowledge. Or do you share a home with a whole bunch of people? You're a renter and you've got 10 friends all in the same place. And by the way, my daughter did that earlier in COVID, where she and 10 friends went to an Airbnb in Utah. All of them have their own jobs. All of them have their own lives going on, and they're all working on the Wi-Fi throughout the house during the month of February. Well, what if one of their friends worked on an IPO, an initial public offering, and somebody else in the house was strapped for cash and heard about that? Now you've got an insider trading issue.
Yeah.
So you really need to understand who's in the environment where your assets are, where is the vulnerability, and monitor that environment. That's one of those controls that you want to think about once you've identified that potential risk. When you're looking at the vulnerabilities and the risks that you identify, what is going to be the impact and who's going to be impacted? And what's interesting is I want to use the example of the General Data Protection Regulation. So in GDPR, you may have a compromise of personal information. The question is, what is the likelihood of harm before it becomes a reportable breach? So let's suppose that Chris and I are in business together. I'm here in New Jersey and Chris is in the EU. I have Chris's name, presumably that's available from public records. I have Chris's business email address. I have Chris's work phone number. I don't have his home address. I don't have his personal Gmail account. And that information gets compromised. Chris's name, the title in his company, his work email, his work phone number. What's the likelihood of Chris being harmed if that information is compromised. If the likelihood is nominal, the resulting harm is nominal, I may not have a reportable issue here. Depending on the company, depending on your contract, they may say, no, we don't publish on our website who our CEO is, who our CFO is. We're not a publicly traded company, and we don't need to make that information available, and we don't want you as our vendor to make it available. So even though under law that may not be information that could have a big impact, by your contract, it could have a big impact. In terms of your own business operations, if your systems are compromised, what's the impact? Well, if you're hit by ransomware and you don't have backups, are you dead in the water? Now you've got lost time, loss of information, loss of productivity, loss of revenue, loss of credibility. How are you going to convince your customers that you're keeping their information secure if you can't keep your own information secure? And again, if we think about killware, do you now have risk to physical property or to human beings and their lives? You really want to understand when you do that risk assessment, is it a high risk, is it a medium risk, or is it a low risk? And in fact, if you bring in a third-party vendor to do this risk assessment for you properly, that's the type of report you're going to get back. They're going to rate for you the risks, and they're going to also give you recommendations how to remediate or mitigate those risks. Look at those reports, understand them, evaluate them in the context of your risk tolerance. Maybe you don't care if certain information is compromised. Maybe the resulting impact is nominal. But if it's a high impact on your business, on your credibility, it's something you're going to want to address. Again, think about if email systems are compromised. Are you now going to be the subject of a denial of service attack if somebody can get into your systems? And the problem with the denial of service attack and the way these things are executed is somebody could be flooding your system with emails. They use bots and they throw gazillion emails at Chris's system. Not only is his system now running slower, but in so many of those emails that now I'm trying to clean out so I can keep operating, there may in fact be an email with a link to release malware. And I don't realize it because I've been flooded. And by the way, think about airlines. If they're hit with a denial of service attack, are they going to be able to book flights? Are they going to be able to let their customers know that a flight is delayed? The potential impact on control systems. Back in, I believe it was 2013, the Ukrainian grid was compromised 2 days before Christmas, and cities went dark because those control systems were impacted. That's huge. By the way, think about what the US government did to an Iranian centrifuge. We launched a virus into an Iranian centrifuge so that they couldn't process uranium. Now, for those of us who are here in America, we think that's a really good thing. In Iran, yeah, probably not so much. But these are the types of impacts you need to understand. If I have this vulnerability, what's going to be the impact on my system? You want to reduce the attack surface, but you also want to understand what you've left there. How is it going to impact your operations, your employees, your customers, your potential customers? Now, one of the things that you may hear about are pen tests or penetration tests. So there's different types of risk assessments. Some risk
All right,
assessments
Michelle,
are done by...
Sorry about that. We have about 2 minutes-ish.
We are almost done, and I appreciate the heads up.
Awesome.
So the penetration test is just like what it sounds. It's not just saying, do you have protocols in place? It's not just saying, okay, are you checking somebody at the door to make sure that when Chris comes in, he's actually got an appointment and he's supposed to be there. A penetration test tries to get into your environment. They will see, do you have those open doors in your systems? Do you have poor passwords that I can get in? And what you want to do when you hire a company to do your risk assessment and pen test, assess them. Go ask them for their SOC reports, ask them for their certifications, negotiate the terms, make sure they have cyber insurance. And by the way, when you get the results of that risk assessment and pen test, please don't leave it where it's going to be vulnerable. Make sure that it's secured properly and receive the report through counsel. I can't promise you it's going to be protected by attorney-client privilege. There's been litigation over that, but if you don't get that report through counsel, it's certainly not going to be protected by attorney-client privilege. Again, when you assess these risks, track them, have a risk register. So my risk is, just by way of example, I don't have appropriate backups or recovery systems in place. I identified it October 1st. What's the potential impact? Is it a high risk? Is it a medium risk or a low risk? And by the way, color code it so it makes it really easy to see at a quick glance, what am I dealing with? Who owns this issue? Does Chris own it to fix it, or do I own it? What's the recommendation from that third-party risk assessor? How do I address this? And make sure that you are keeping management informed, because management can't say anymore, I didn't know it's an IT issue. They're going to be held accountable. So, Chris, timing was really good today. I didn't go over. Identify your assets, assess your vulnerabilities, understand your attack surface, rate those issues, implement controls. And by the way, once you put those controls in place, we've got better backups now. What's my residual risk? And whatever you're doing, document it. Have that risk register, have that risk assessment, and do this at least annually. This is not a one and done, whether it's for you or your vendors. Folks, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I think we may have a few more questions in there.
Yes. So, let's see. The questions to ask a vendor. What
right, and I think we
they?
talked about that a little bit already.
Yeah. And is it safe, or how can I protect myself from doing client appointments on Zoom?
When you're doing client appointments on Zoom, first of all, you don't want to use a public Zoom account. You want to have an account for your business. You want to make sure that when you set up the meeting invite, it has passwords. Use the waiting room, so that, let's suppose that I'm supposed to have a meeting with Susie Smith, but somehow Chris got those access credentials. And I look in the waiting room and I see Chris. I'm like, who's Chris? Don't admit him if he's not supposed to be there. Once the people who are supposed to be in the meeting are there, close the meeting so people can't come in. You can also remove the chat feature from meetings, so that, we're using the chat right here. Let's suppose you don't want people to be going back and forth offline. Don't let them do it. And by the way, one of the issues that has come up in depositions online is, if you put a document into the chat, can somebody grab that? So think about how a chat function is being used and who's going to be able to extract information from that. And certainly, unless you want people to attend an event, don't put the credentials for the event online. If you're not sure, go to Zoom's site and ask them, how can I better secure my environment? Ask these questions. And if you do have an IT resource or a managed service provider, ask them, how can I better secure not just Zoom or Microsoft Teams, any of these resources that I'm using that are from third parties? How do I better lock it down? Chris, do we have any other questions?
No. So I think we're all good to go. So thank you again, Michelle. Let me just go ahead and pull up my screen. Let's see. All right, so that was part 2 of your Protect Your Tech series. Now Michelle joins us again for next week for part 3, and that's proactive planning for small business cyber attacks. So I know a lot of us will get into trouble and only think of the solution once we're in the trouble, right? So it's always good to have a plan before that happens, so you know exactly what to do. So Michelle's going to show you exactly what to do before a cyber attack happens next week, 12 o'clock, same time, same place. And just remember, the NJSBDC, we've helped 13,000 plus small businesses with consulting, events, resources. So if you want to register to speak to one of our experts, including Michelle, It's going to be at njsbdc.com/request-counseling. Any last words of advice for protecting your business assets, Michelle?
Think about where your information is. Think about who has access to it, what the damage could be if that information were compromised, and then put in appropriate controls and processes and operations to minimize or remove that risk. Stay safe, stay secure, and stay informed.
Thank you, everyone, and I'll see everyone next week. Bye.